Okay, today I'm going to be reading Harry Potter. This is Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone by J.K. Rowling. And illustrated from Mary Grandpierre. I'm gonna show you the pictures. Sorry, have my LED lights on, but this is the front cover, and then this is the first picture for the second introduction to it. Chapter 1, The Boy Who Lived. Then that's the picture. Oh yeah, and don't worry about all these sticky notes. I'm currently reading it to my little cousins, and I'm putting sticky notes in places of the character's description, so I can end up drawing them from the description in the books. Okay, anyways, Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, Chapter 1, The Boy Who Lived. Mr. and Mrs. Dursley of number 4 Privet Drive were proud to say they were perfectly normal, thank you very much. They were the last people you'd expect to be involved in anything strange or mysterious, because they just didn't hold with such nonsense. Because Mr. Dursley was the director of a firm called Grungens, which made drills. He was a big, beefy man with hardly any neck, although he did have a very large mustache. Mrs. Dursley was thin and blonde, and had nearly twice as a usual amount of neck, which came in very useful, as she spent most of her time carrying over garden fences, spying on the neighbors. The Dursleys had a small son called Dudley, and in their opinion, there was no finer boy anywhere. The Dursleys had everything they wanted, but they also had a secret, and their greatest fear was that somebody would discover it. They didn't think they could bear it if anyone found out about the Potters. Mrs. Potter was Mrs. Dursley's sister, but they hadn't met for several years. In fact, Mrs. Dursley pretended she didn't have a sister, because her sister and her good-for-nothing husband were as un-Dursleyish as it was possible. The Dursleys shuddered to think that what the neighbors would say if the Potters arrived in their street. The Dursleys knew that the Potters had a small son too, but they had never even seen him. This boy was another good reason for keeping the Potters away. They didn't want Dudley mixing with a child like that. When Mr. and Mrs. Dursley woke up on the dull gray Tuesday our story starts, there was nothing about the cloudy sky outside to suggest that strange and mysterious things would soon be happening all over the country. Mr. Dursley hummed as he picked out his most boring tie for work, and Mrs. Dursley gossiped away happily as she wrestled the screaming Dudley into his high chair. None of them noticed a large tawny owl flutter past the window. At 8:30, Mr. Dursley picked up his briefcase, pecked Mrs. Dursley on the cheek, and tried to kiss Dudley goodbye, but missed because Dudley was having a tantrum and throwing his cereal at the wall. "Little tyke," chortled Mr. Dursley as he left the house. He got into his car and backed out of number 4's drive. It was on the It was on the corner of the street that he noticed a strange sign of something peculiar. A cat reading a map? For a second, Mr. Dursley didn't realize what he had seen. Then he jerked his head around and looked again. There was a tabby cat standing on the corner of Privet Drive. But there wasn't a map in sight. What would he have been thinking of? It must have been the trick of the light. Mr. Dursley blinked and stared at the cat. It stared back as Mr. Dursley drove around the corner and picked up the corner. As Mr. Dursley drove around the corner and up the road, he watched the cat in the mirror. It was now reading the sign that said Privet Drive. No, looking at the sign. Cats couldn't read maps or signs. Mr. Dursley gave himself a little shake and put the cat out of his mind. As he drove toward the town, he thought of nothing except for a large order of drills he was hoping to get that day. But on the edge of the town, drills were driven out of his mind by something else. As he sat in the usual traffic jam, he couldn't help noticing that there seemed to be a lot of strangely dressed people about. People in cloaks. Mr. Dursley couldn't bear people who dressed in funny clothes. The get-ups you saw on young people, he supposed this was some stupid new fashion. He drummed his finger on his steering wheel, and his eyes fell on a huddle of these weirdos standing quite close by. They were whispering excitedly together. Mr. Dursley was enraged to see that a couple of them weren't young at all. Why, that man had to be older than he was, and wearing an emerald green cloak. The nerve of him. But then it struck him, Mr. Dursley, that this was probably some silly stunt. These people were obviously collecting for something. Yes, that would be it. The traffic moved on, and a few minutes later, Mr. Dursley arrived at Grunging's parking lot, his mind back on drills. Mr. Dursley always sat with his back to the window in his office on the 9th floor. If he hadn't, he might have found it harder to concentrate on drills that morning. He didn't see the owls swooping past in broad daylight, though people down in the streets did. They pointed and gazed open-mouthed as the owl after owl sped overhead. Most of them had never seen owls even at nighttime. Mr. Dursley, however, had a perfectly normal owl-free morning. He yelled at 5 different people. He made several important telephone calls. He shouted a bit more, and he was in a very good mood until lunchtime, when he thought he'd stretch his legs and walk across the road to buy himself a bun from the bakery. He'd forgotten all about the people in the cloaks until he passed. Oh, sorry. Where was I? Till he passed a group of them next to the bakery. He eyed them angrily as he passed. He didn't know why, but they made made him uneasy. This bunch of whispering excitedly, too, and he couldn't see a single collecting tin. It was on his way back past them, clutching a large donut in a bag, that he caught a few words of what they were saying. The Potters. That's right. That's what I heard. Yes, their son, Harry. Mr. Dursley stopped dead in fear. Fear flooded him. He looked back and whispered as if he wanted to say something to them, but thought better of it. He dashed back across the road, hurried up to his office, snapped at his secretary not to disturb him, seized his telephone, and had almost finished dialing his home number when he changed his mind. He put the receiver back down and stroked his mustache, thinking, no, he was being stupid. Potter was such an unusual name. Wasn't such an unusual name. He was sure there were lots of people called Potter, although son Potter who had a son called Harry. Came to think of it, he wasn't even sure if his nephew was called Harry. He never even seen the boy. It might have been Harvey or Harold. There was no point in worrying Mrs. Dursley. She also got so upset at the mention of her sister. He didn't blame her if he had a sister like that. But all the same, those people in the cloaks. He found it a lot harder to concentrate on drills that afternoon. And when he left the building at 5 o'clock, he was still worried, so worried that he walked straight into someone outside the door. Sorry, he grunted, as a tiny old man stumbled and almost fell. It was a few seconds before Mr. Dursley realized that the man he was wearing a velvet cloak. He didn't seem upset at all. Didn't seem upset at being almost knocked to the ground. On the contrary, his face split into a wide smile, and he said in a squeaky voice that made passers-by stare, "Don't be sorry, my dear sir, for nothing could upset me today. Rejoice, you know, for you know who has gone at last. Even muggles like yourself should be celebrating this happy, happy day." And the old man hugged Mr. Dursley around the middle and walked off. Mr. Dursley stood rooted on the spot. He had been hugged by a complete stranger. He also thought he had been called a muggle, whatever that was. He was rattled. He hurried to his car and set off home, hoping he was imagining things, which he had never hoped before, because it didn't improve. He didn't approve of imagination. He pulled into the driveway of number 4. The first thing he saw, and it didn't improve his mood, was the tabby cat he'd spotted in the morning. It was now sitting on his garden wall. He was sure it was the same one. It had the same markings around its eyes. "Shoo!" said Mr. Dursley loudly. The cat didn't move. It just gave him a stern look. Was this normal cat behavior? Mr. Dursley wondered, trying to pull himself together. He couldn't let himself into the house. He was still determined not to mention anything to his wife. Mr. Dursley had a nice, Mrs. Dursley had a nice, normal day. She told him over dinner all about the next door neighbors' problems and their daughter, and how Dudley had learned a new word, won't. Mr. Dursley tried to act normal when Dudley had been put to bed. He went into the living room in time to catch the last report of the evening news. And finally, bird watchers everywhere have reported that the national owls have been behaving very unusually today. Although owls normally hunt at night and hardly ever seen in daylight, there have been hundreds of sightings of these birds flying in everywhere directions since sunrise. Experts are unable to explain why these owls have suddenly changed their sleeping patterns. The newscasters allowed himself to grin. Most mysteriously, why did I sound like that when I said that? Most mysteriously, and now over to Jim McGriffin with the weather, joining to be the more showers of owls tonight, Jim. Well, Ted, said the weatherman, I don't know about that, but it's not only the owls that have been acting oddly today. Viewers are apart to Kent, Yorsh, and Dundee have been phoning in to tell me that instead of rain I promised yesterday, they've had a downpour of shooting stars. Perhaps people have been celebrating bonfire night early. It's not until next week, folks, but I can promise a wet night tonight. Mr. Dursley sat frozen in his armchair. Shooting stars all over Britain, owls flying by daylight, mysterious people in cloaks all over the place, and a whisper about the Potters. Mrs. Dursley came into the living room carrying 2 cups of tea. One was it was no good. He'd have to say something to her. He cleared his throat nervously. Petunia, dear, you haven't heard from your sister lately, have you? As he expected, Mrs. Dursley looked shocked and angry. After all, they normally pretended she didn't exist. No, she said sharply. Why? Funny stuff on the news, he mumbled. Owls, shooting stars, and there is a lot of funny-looking people in the streets in the town today. So? She snapped. Well, I just thought maybe it was something to have to do with, her crowd. Mrs. Dursley sipped her tea through her pursed lips. Mr. Dursley wondered whether he dared to tell her he'd heard the name Potter. He decided he didn't care. Instead, he said, as carefully as he could, their son. He'd be about Dudley's age now, wouldn't he? I suppose so, said Mrs. Dursley stiffly. What's his name again? Howard, isn't it? Harry. A nasty common name, if you ask me. Oh, yes, said Mr. Dursley, his heart sinking horribly. Yes, I quite agree. He didn't say anything. He didn't say another word on the subject as they went upstairs to bed. While Mrs. Dursley was in the bathroom, Mr. Dursley crept to the bedroom window and peered down into the front garden. The cat was still there. It was staring down Privet Drive as though it was waiting for something. He was imagining things. Could all this have anything to do with the Potters? Sorry, a sticky note's in the way. If it got out that they were related to a pair of, well, he didn't think he could bear it. The Dursleys got into bed. Mrs. Dursley fell asleep quickly, but Mr. Dursley laid awake, turning it all over in his mind. His last comforting thoughts before he fell asleep was, even if the Potters were involved, there was no reason for them to come near him and Mrs. Dursley. The Potters knew very well that he and Petunia thought that about them and their kind. He couldn't see how he and Petunia could get mixed up in anything that might be going on. He yawned, turned over. It couldn't affect them. How very wrong he was. Mr. Dursley might have been drifting into an uneasy sleep, but the cat on the wall outside was showing no sign of sleepiness. It was sitting as still as a statue, its eyes fixed unblinkingly on the far corner of Privet Drive. It didn't so much of quiver when a car door slammed on the next street over, nor was two owls swooping overhead. In fact, it was nearly midnight before the cat had moved at all. A man had appeared on the corner the cat had been watching. Appeared so suddenly and silent, he'd have thought he'd just popped out of the ground. The cat's tail twitched and its eyes narrowed. Nothing like this man had ever been seen on Privet Drive. He was tall, thin, and very old, judging by the silver in his hair and beard, which was both long enough to tuck into his belt. He was wearing long robes, a purple cloak, and sweeping the ground, and high-heeled buckled boots. His blue eyes were light, bright, and sparkling behind half-moon spectacles, and his nose was very long and crooked, as though it had been broken at least twice. This man's name was Albus Dumbledore. Another sticky note. Albus Dumbledore didn't seem to realize that he had just arrived on a street where anything from his name to his boots was unwelcomed. He was busy rummaging in his cloak, looking for something. But he didn't seem to realize he was being watched, because he looked up suddenly at the cat, which was still staring at him. From the other side of the street. For some reason, the sight of the cat seemed to amuse him. He chuckled and muttered, "I should have known." Ooh. He found what he was looking for, and inside his pocket, it seemed to be a silver cigarette lighter. He flicked it open and held it in the air and clicked it. The nearest street lamp went out with a little pop. It clicked again. The next lamp flickered into darkness. 12 times he clicked the put-outer until the only lights left on the whole street were two tiny pricks in the distance, which were those eyes of the watching cat. the cat watching him. If anyone looked out of their window now, even beady-eyed Mrs. Dursley, they wouldn't have been able to see anything that was happening down on the pavement. Dumbledore slipped the put-outer back inside his pocket of his cloak and set down the street toward number 4, where he sat down on the wall next to the cat. He didn't look at it, but after a moment, he spoke to it. "Fancy seeing you here, Professor McGonagall." He turned to smile at the tabby, but it was gone. Instead, he was smiling at a rather severe-looking woman who was wearing square glasses exactly in the shape of the markings of the cat's had around its eyes. She too was wearing a cloak, an emerald one. Her black hair was drawn into a tight bun, and she looked distinctly ruffled. How did you know it was me?" she asked. "My dear Professor, I've never seen a cat sit so stiffly." "You'd be stiff if you've been sitting on a brick wall all day," said Professor McGonagall. "All day? When you could have been celebrating? I must have passed a dozen feasts and parties on my way here." Professor McGonagall sniffed angrily. "Oh, yes, everyone's celebrating all right," she said impatiently. "You'd think they'd be... Oh, sorry, wrong. You'd think they'd be a bit more careful. But no, even Muggles have noticed something's going on. It was on their news." She jerked her head back to the Dursleys' dark living room window. "I heard it. Flocks of owls, shooting stars. Well, they're not completely stupid. They were bound to notice something. Shooting stars in Kent. I'll bet it was Deldius Tiggle. He never had much sense. Sorry if I butcher names. I'm going to try my best." You can't blame them," said Dumbledore gently. "We've had precious little to celebrate for 11 years. "I know that," said Professor McGonagall irritably. "But that's no reason to lose their heads. People are being downright careless. Out on the streets in broad daylight, not even dressed in Muggle clothes, swapping rumors." She threw a sharp sideways glance at Dumbledore. Excuse me. Here, as though hoping he was going to tell her something, but he didn't, so she went on. "A fine thing it would be on the very day you know who seems to have disappeared. At last, the Muggles found out about us all. I suppose he really has gone, Dumbledore." "It certainly seems so," said Dumbledore. "We've much to be thankful for. Would you care a lemon drop?" "A what?" "A lemon drop. They are kind of Muggle sweet I'm rather fond of." "No, thank you," said Professor McGonagall coldly, as though she didn't think it was the moment for lemon drops. As I say, even if you know who has gone." "My dear Professor, surely a sensible person like yourself can call him by his name. All this you-know-who nonsense. For 11 years have been trying to persuade people to call him by his proper name, Voldemort." Professor McGonagall flinched by Dumbledore, who was unsticking his lemon drop seemed not to have noticed. It all gets confusing if we keep saying, you know who. I have never seen any reason to be frightened of saying Voldemort's name. I know you haven't, said Professor McGonagall, sounding half exasperated, half admiring. But everyone knows. But you're different. Everyone knows you're the only one you know. Oh, all right, Voldemort was afraid of. You flatter me, said Dumbledore calmly. Voldemort had powers I will never have. Only because you're too, well, noble to use them. It's lucky it's dark. I haven't blunched so much since Madame Pomfrey told me she liked my new earmuffs. Professor McGonagall shot a sharp look at Dumbledore and said, The owls are nothing next to the rumors that are flying around. You know what everyone is saying about why he disappeared, about what finally stopped him? It seemed that Professor McGonagall had reached the point she had been most anxious to discuss. The real reason she had been waiting on a cold, hard wall all day, for neither as a cat nor as a woman had she fixed Dumbledore with such piercing stare as she did now. It was planned to whatever everyone was saying. She was not going to believe it until Dumbledore had told her it was true. Dumbledore, however, was choosing another lemon drop and did not answer. What they are saying, she pressed on, is that last night Voldemort turned up in Grodric's Hollow. He went to find the Potters. The rumor that Lily and James are that they're dead. Dumbledore bowed his head. Professor McGonagall gasped, Lily and James? I can't believe it. I didn't want to believe it. Oh, Albus. Dumbledore reached out and patted her on the shoulder. I know, he said heavily. Professor McGonagall's voice trembled as she went on. That's not all. They're saying he tried to kill the Potter's son, Harry, but he couldn't. He couldn't kill that little boy. No one knows why or how, but they're saying that when he couldn't kill Harry Potter, Voldemort's powers somehow broke, and that's why he's gone. Dumbledore nodded gloomily. It's true. Flattered Professor McGonagall. After all he's done, all the people he's killed a little boy. He couldn't kill a little boy? It's just outstanding. How all these things to stop him? But how in the name of heaven did Harry survive? We can only guess, said Dumbledore. We must never know. Professor McGonagall pulled out a lace handkerchief and dabbed underneath her eyes of her spectacles. Dumbledore gave a great sniff as he took a golden watch from his pocket and examined it. It was a very odd watch. It had 12 hands and no numbers. Instead, little planters were moving around on the edges. It must have made sense to Dumbledore, though, because he put it back in his pocket and said, Hagrid's late. I suppose he who... I suppose it was he who told you I'd be here, by the way. Yes, said Professor McGonagall, and I don't suppose you're going to tell me why you're here, of all places. I've come to bring Harry to his aunt and uncle. They are the only family he has left now. You don't mean, you can't mean, the people who live here? Here? That was weird, cried Professor McGonagall, jumping to her feet and pointing to number 4. Dumbledore, you can't! I've been watching them all day. You can't find 2 people who are less like us, and they've got this son. I saw him kicking his mother all the way up the street, screaming for sweets. Harry Potter, come and live here? It's the best place for him, said Dumbledore firmly. His aunt and uncle will be able to explain everything to him when he gets older. I've written them a letter. A letter? Repeated Professor McGonagall faintly, sitting back down on the wall. Really, Dumbledore, you think you can explain all this in a letter? These people will never understand him. He'll be famous, a legend. I wouldn't be surprised if today was known as Harry Potter Day in the future. There will be books written about Harry. Every people in the world will know his name. Exactly, said Dumbledore, looking very seriously over the top of his half-moon spectacles. It wouldn't be enough to turn any boy's head, famous before he can even walk and talk, famous for something he won't even remember. Can't you see how much better off he'll be growing up, away from all of this, until he's ready to take it? Professor McGonagall opened her mouth, changed her mind, swallowed, then said, Yes, you're right, of course. But how is the boy getting here, Dumbledore? She eyed his cloak suddenly, as though she thought he might be hiding Harry underneath it. Hagrid's bringing him. You think it's wise to trust Hagrid with something as important as this? I would trust Hagrid with my life, said Dumbledore. I'm not saying his heart isn't in the right place, said Professor McGonagall grudgingly, but you can't pretend he's not careless. He does tend to... What was that? A loud rumbling sound had broken the silence around them. It grew steadily louder as they looked up and down the street for some sight of headlights and swelling of the roar. As they both looked up at the sky, a huge motorcycle fell, and the air landed and landed on the road in front of them. A motorcycle. If the motorcycle was huge, it was nothing to the man. It was nothing to the man sitting astride it. He was almost twice as tall as a normal man, and at least 5 times as wide. He looked simply too big to be allowed, and so wild. Long, tangled, and bushy black hair of his beard hid most of his face, and the size of where am I? The long, tangled, bushy black hair and beard hid most of his face. His hands the size of trash can lids, and his feet in their leather boots were probably baby dolphins. In his vest, muscled arms, he was holding a bundle of blankets. "Hagrid," said Dumbledore, sounding relieved. "At last. And where did you get the motorcycle?" "Borrowed it, Professor Dumbledore, sir," said the giant, climbing carefully off the motorcycle as he spoke. "Young Sirius Black lent it to me. I've got it from him, sir." "No problems, were there?" "No, sir. House was almost destroyed, but I got him out all right before Muggles started swarming all around. He fell asleep when we were flying over Bristle." Dumbledore and Professor McGonagall bent forward over the bundle of blankets. Inside was a visible baby boy, fast asleep. Under a tuft of jet black hair on his forehead, they could see a curiously shaped cut, like a lightning bolt. "Is that where?" whispered Professor McGonagall. "Yes," said Dumbledore. "He'll have that scar forever." "Couldn't you do something about it, Dumbledore?" "Even if I could, I wouldn't. Scars can be more handy. I've had one myself about a year. And that was the perfect map of London Underground. Well, give him here, Hagrid. We better get this over with." Dumbledore took Harry into his arms and turned toward the Dursleys' house. Could I say some? Oh, could I say some goodbye to him, sir?" said Hagrid. He bent his great shaggy head over Harry and gave him what must have been a very scratchy, whisky kiss. Then suddenly Hagrid let out a howl like a wounded dog. "Shh!" hissed Professor McGonagall. You'll wake up the Muggles." Sorry," sobbed Hagrid, taking a large spotted handkerchief and burying his face in it. "But I can't stand it. Lily and James dead, and poor little Harry off to live with Muggles." Yes, all very sad. But get a grip on yourself, Hagrid, or we'll be found," said Professor McGonagall whispered, patting Hagrid gingerly on the arm as Dumbledore stepped over the low garden wall and walked over to the front door. He laid Harry gently on the doorstep and took out the leather of his cloak, tucked it inside Harry's blankets, and then came back to the other two. For a full minute, the three of them stood there and looked at the little bundle. Hagrid's shoulders shook. Professor McGonagall blinked furiously, and the twinkling light that usually shone in Dumbledore's eyes seemed to have gone out. "Well," Dumbledore said finally, That's that. We've no business staying here. We may as well as join the celebrations." "Yeah," said Hagrid in a very muffled voice. "We'd best get this break away. Good night, Professor McGonagall. Good night, Professor Dumbledore, sir." Wiping his streaming eyes on his jacket sleeve, Hagrid swung himself into the motorcycle and kicked the engine into life. With a roar, it rose into the air and off into the night. "I shall see you soon, I expect, Professor McGonagall," said Dumbledore, nodding to her. Professor McGonagall blew in her nose in reply. Dumbledore turned and walked back down the street. On the corner, he stopped and took out his silver put-outer. He clicked it once. All 12 bolts of light sped back into the street lamps, so Privet Drive grown suddenly orange, and he could make out a tabby cat slinking around the corner at the other end of the street. He couldn't see the bundle of he could see the bundle of on the step of number 4. "Good luck, Harry," he murmured as he turned his heel, and a swish of his cloak he was gone. A breeze ruffled in a neat hedge of privet Drive, which lay silent, tidy under the inky sky. The very last place you would expect astonishing things to happen. Harry Potter rolled over in his blankets without waking up. One small hand closed on the letter beside him, and he slept on, not knowing he was special, not knowing he was famous, not knowing he would be awoken in a few hours' time by Mrs. Dursley screaming, and as she opened the front door to put out the milk bottles, nor that he would spend the next few weeks being pelted and punched by his cousin Dudley. He couldn't know that at this very moment, people meeting in secret all over the country were holding up their glasses and saying in hushed voices, "To Harry Potter, the boy who lived." And that was chapter 1 for Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. Come back next time for chapter 2.